Some men lose everything in a courtroom battle, while others have their lives dismantled by a sudden corporate hostile takeover. Me? I lost mine in a sterile hospital room at 2:47 in the morning, holding the hand of the only woman I ever truly loved, while making a sacred promise I already knew was going to cost me everything. But here is the most unforgivable part. While I was sitting there wiping the cold sweat from her forehead, her own flesh and blood was on the phone, treating her dying breath like a real estate negotiation. He thought he was calling to steal her empire. He had no idea he was actually walking straight into a trap that would destroy him. Welcome back to Dad's Ultimate Payback. If you are new to the channel, hit that subscribe button right now and drop a comment below, letting me know where you're watching from. Trust me, you are going to need a heavy dose of justice by the time this chapter is through. Spectrum Health Butterworth Hospital on a freezing Michigan morning smells strictly of industrial bleach and subtle desperation, a clinical atmosphere I had grown far too familiar with over 11 straight days of isolation. Clara was lying in room 412, battling a virulent strain of pneumonia that had bypassed her lungs and begun shutting down her organs with terrifying speed. The nurses on the 4th floor, tough, compassionate women who had seen every version of human tragedy, had long since stopped asking questions, leaving an extra pillow and a wool blanket on the corner armchair for me without a word. I spent every waking hour sitting by her bedside, rubbing her ice-cold fingers, desperately trying to friction life back into a woman who had once filled every room she entered with an indomitable, radiant presence. Now, reduced to a labyrinth of monitors, intravenous drips, and an oxygen mask fogging up with shallow, rattling breaths, she looked heartbreakingly fragile. Yet, the true cruelty of her final hours didn't come from the disease itself, but from the phone call I had received just 20 minutes before her final decline, a call that permanently shattered any lingering illusions I held about her biological family. Terry, her 26-year-old son who had spent the last decade treating his mother like an ATM machine while ghosting every family gathering, hadn't bothered to visit her once during her 2 weeks in the intensive care unit. Instead, his name had flashed across my mobile screen, and when I answered expecting a shred of filial concern, Terry hadn't even asked about her vital signs or her prognosis. His voice was laced with transactional urgency as he demanded to know whether Clara had updated her estate documents yet, explicitly badgering me to ensure the corporate shares and real estate deeds were signed over to his name before she drew her last breath, fearing that I might somehow inherit what he felt entitled to. Standing in that dim hallway listening to a greedy, ungrateful boy treat his dying mother's life like a real estate transaction ignited an icy, dangerous resentment in my chest, laying bare a level of sociopathic selfishness that went far beyond anything I had ever witnessed. When I returned to her bedside, Clara weakly tugged at her oxygen mask, her eyes clearing with that terrifying pre-death lucidity that everyone in a hospital recognizes but no one ever wants to name. She looked at me with 15 years of shared history in her gaze, begging me with her last remaining ounce of strength to make a solemn vow. "Promise me you'll take care of him, Garrett," she whispered, her fingers locking onto mine with surprising strength. "Don't leave him behind. He needs you whether he knows it or not." I looked down at the woman who had given me 15 years of genuine love, and then thought of Terry's phone call waiting in my call log. I knew exactly what kind of monster he was, and I knew exactly what kind of trap he was walking into. I looked her straight in the eyes, my voice steady, measured, and without a trace of hesitation. "I promise, Clara," I said softly. "I'll make sure he gets exactly what he's got coming to him." She smiled peacefully, believing she had secured her son's future, while I locked the promise into my soul, knowing full well that my vow wasn't an act of mercy, but the architectural blueprint for a financial trap from which Terry Vance would never escape. The cold ground of Woodlawn Cemetery on the northeast side of Grand Rapids offered no comfort when we buried Clara on a Tuesday in March. The biting winter wind swept across the grave sites, carrying with it a slate-gray sky that matched the heavy, suffocating weight in my chest. About 40 people had gathered to pay their respects, but the atmosphere among Clara's biological family members was entirely devoid of genuine grief. Terry stood directly across the open grave from me, encased in an expensive, imported wool jacket that cost more than some people's monthly car payments. Flanking him like loyal vultures were Aunt Evelyn Vance Lindell on his left and Uncle Richie Vance on his right, the infamous Vance family triangle. Evelyn wore an expression of smug satisfaction, looking less like a mourning sister and more like an executor executing a long-awaited asset seizure, while Richie kept adjusting his tie and glancing sideways at the floral arrangements, as if he were already calculating the square footage and resale value of the estate. They didn't look like people bidding a final farewell to a beloved mother and sister. They looked like aggressive buyers sizing up a property at a liquidation sale, their eyes gleaming with the predatory anticipation of a windfall they believed they had already secured. The true escalation of their predatory entitlement, however, did not happen beside the gravesite, but detonated right on the front porch of our home on Cascade Road immediately following the funeral reception. I had stepped outside for a brief moment of fresh air near my modest pickup truck, trying to escape the stifling atmosphere of neighbors offering hollow condolences and relatives whispering behind cupped hands in the living room. Suddenly, the gravel in our long driveway crunched under heavy tires, and Terry's pristine high-end white Ram 1500, a massive company-owned vehicle he treated like a throne, pulled up aggressively, slamming to a halt right behind my vehicle like a monument to arrogance. Terry hopped out of the cab with his hands thrust deep into his designer pockets, wearing a wide, nauseating smile of victory. Without a single word of condolence, without even acknowledging that we had buried his mother less than an hour prior, he launched straight into his rehearsed speech, declaring loudly that the free ride was over and that I needed to pack my bags and clear out by sunset. But Terry's cruelty crossed an unforgivable line when he turned his malice toward the memory of the woman who had given him life. Emboldened by Evelyn and Richie stepping up behind him to form a menacing wall of unified greed, Terry sneered at the heavy oak front door and launched into a vicious, unprovoked tirade mocking his own mother. He loudly declared that Clara must have been out of her mind and pathologically stupid to trust a blue-collar worker like me for 15 solid years, mocking her deep devotion, her business instincts, and her final wishes as the delusions of a dying woman who had been manipulated by a gold digger. He spat out insults about her legacy, degrading her intelligence right on the very threshold of the home she had built, believing that I would finally snap, lose my temper, and give him the public altercation he needed to call the police and drag me out in disgrace. The sheer disrespect toward a woman whose body wasn't even cold yet sent a sharp surge of anger through my veins, pushing the drama to a boiling point. Yet, I did not raise my voice. I did not throw a punch or let a single muscle in my face betray the storm raging inside me. Instead, I simply kept my shoulders relaxed, let out a slow, controlled breath and stared back at him with unyielding composure. Let him gloat. Let him insult his mother's memory and revel in his imagined victory. He thought my silence was a sign of weakness, completely blind to the fact that every arrogant word he spoke was just another nail driving him deeper into the airtight trap I had already prepared. By 7:30 on the following Monday morning, I was back at my desk inside the corporate headquarters of Vance Pierce Design and Furniture Corporation on Granville Avenue SW in Grand Rapids, Michigan. The building itself was a masterpiece of industrial architecture, a converted historical brick warehouse that Clara had meticulously redesigned from the ground up 12 years prior, featuring exposed timber ceiling beams, a custom-crafted walnut reception desk, and a sprawling showroom floor lined with $8,000 dining sets that gleamed under warm gallery spotlights. The workspace looked like it belonged on the glossy cover of an interior design magazine. Clara had possessed an extraordinary eye for aesthetic brilliance and structural beauty, transforming raw industrial space into a high-end luxury brand. But what the building looked like on the surface and what it required to survive financially behind closed doors had always been my exclusive domain. I settled into my leather chair, placed my black coffee on the corner of the desk, and opened my laptop to begin drafting a comprehensive inventory list. This wasn't an emotional list of grievances or a hurried revenge checklist. It was a cold, precise maintenance log, because true professional restructuring is simply the act of stopping work and logistical support you were never legally or morally obligated to provide in the first place. My morning routine was abruptly shattered at 8:45 a.m., when the heavy oak door to my office swung open without a prior knock, revealing David Fox, our lead corporate attorney. David had served as our legal counsel for 9 rigorous years, earning a reputation as a meticulous, razor-sharp lawyer who ironed his dress shirts at midnight and kept annotated, dog-eared copies of the Michigan Business Corporation Act resting on his nightstand. He was constitutionally incapable of dramatic outbursts, which made his current physical state all the more shocking. He marched straight across the Persian rug, slammed a massive 4-inch stack of corporate compliance files onto my mahogany desk with a sharp, explosive thud that sounded like a gunshot, and stood over me with his silk tie aggressively loosened at the collar, the ultimate psychological equivalent of a total nervous breakdown for a man of his rigid professional stature. Breathing heavily, his eyes blazing with righteous disbelief, David demanded to know how I could possibly be sitting here sipping coffee after casually handing away a multi-million-dollar empire to parasitic amateur like Terry Vance. Tell me right now, Garrett, that you did not just agree to sign over the entire corporate infrastructure to that ungrateful boy, he demanded, his voice dropping into that fierce, controlled register attorneys use when they are physically restraining themselves from screaming. I leaned back into my leather chair, maintaining my composure while gesturing to the empty client chair opposite my desk. "Good morning, David," I replied, offering a faint, reassuring smile. David dragged a hand across his face, shaking his head in exasperation before dropping the bombshell that elevated our situation from a bitter family dispute to an all-out corporate war. Before I could even outline my strategy, David leaned forward and revealed a piece of intelligence he had uncovered through our corporate network just an hour earlier. He informed me that while Clara's body was still warm and we were barely finished arranging her funeral flowers, Terry had already gone behind our backs, making clandestine phone calls to a commercial furniture competitor in Holland, Michigan, offering to liquidate Clara's lifetime collection of unreleased design blueprints and custom woodworking molds for a fraction of their market value, just to secure a quick cash payout. Terry was planning to gut and sell off his mother's legacy to the highest bidder before the probate ink could even dry, treating her artistic life's work like a garage sale for his own personal enrichment. Hearing that Terry was attempting to butcher Clara's legacy and sell off her most sacred creations to corporate rivals eliminated any lingering hesitation in my mind, hardening my resolve into unyielding steel. I looked up at David, my gaze sharp, and cut off his frantic protests with a single authoritative gesture of my hand. "Drop the transfer papers, David. Full transfer of 100% of the corporate shares directly to Terry Vance," I instructed, my voice entirely devoid of doubt. Suffocating silence descended upon the office as David stared at me the exact way a man stares at someone stepping off the edge of a functional bridge. He warned me that we could tie Terry up in probate court for years, that our product liability leverage was immense, and that grief was clouding my judgment. But when I slid a yellow legal pad across the desk containing my handwritten directives, his professional skepticism morphed into a mixture of shock and reluctant admiration. I instructed him to embed two non-negotiable, lethal clauses deep within the standard boilerplate language of the final transfer addendum. Clauses designed to look like harmless legal filler to an arrogant boy high on victory, but engineered to detonate with clinical accuracy. The first clause would trigger an immediate, automatic bank recall of our $1.5 million commercial credit line within 30 days of ownership transfer, stripping away my personal guarantee and leaving Terry entirely exposed. The second clause would immediately realign our manufacturing land lease to a commercial market rate of $45,000 per month through Logan Holdings, LLC. David stared at the page, swallowed hard, and realized that Terry Vance was about to walk straight into a financial execution chamber disguised as a coronation. With David's finalized clauses embedded in the transfer addendum, my strategy entered its most crucial execution phase over the following 4 weeks. Operating with calculated steps, systematically stripping away every single invisible layer of financial and operational protection I had spent 15 years propping up around Vance Pierce Design, ensuring that when Terry officially took the keys, he would inherit a hollowed-out shell standing directly in the path of a financial hurricane. The first defensive wall to fall was our massive product liability litigation defense. For the better part of the previous year, I had been financing a top-tier corporate defense team from my own private accounts to fight a multi-million-dollar civil lawsuit stemming from a showroom injury claim involving a negligent installation crew and an aggressive plaintiff's attorney from Kalamazoo, Michigan, pumping $60,000 to $70,000 of my own funds into billable hours to keep the company afloat. I picked up my desk phone and called Todd Weaver, the senior partner at Mitchell & Crane. I gave him a direct instruction. As of the official corporate transfer date, our retainer would immediately shift to a month-to-month billing arrangement billed directly to the company ledger, with zero further funding from my pocket. When Todd paused on the line, asking with professional hesitation if Terry's incoming management could sustain those heavy legal billing rates, I let a moment of silence pass before replying that it was going to be Terry Vance's exclusive problem to solve. Watching the last line of corporate defense vanish into thin air, the second defensive wall dissolved with a simple phone call to First Commerce Bank, located on Ottawa Avenue in downtown Grand Rapids, where Janet Roscoe, a seasoned 15-year commercial lending officer, managed our credit facility. Dialing her direct extension, I asked her to formally verify the change of control covenant embedded within our primary commercial loan agreement, wanting confirmation that a transfer of majority ownership would automatically trigger a mandatory portfolio review and empower the bank to call the full outstanding balance of $1,500,000 within 30 days. Hearing the crisp clicking of keyboard keys in her background, Janet confirmed the clause with deadpan bureaucratic certainty, adding the crucial detail that my personal guarantee, the rock-solid financial anchor the bank had relied on for over a decade, would automatically release upon the ownership transfer, leaving Terry entirely stripped of my backing and facing a 30-day countdown to secure a massive capital injection he had no earthly way of obtaining. Yet, the third and most damaging wall to crumble was anchored directly to the sprawling 22-acre industrial complex on the city's southwest side, housing our primary production facilities, the Logan Holdings properties. Years prior, long before Clara and I were married, I had purchased that industrial land under my private LLC, allowing Clara's company to operate on the grounds entirely rent-free for a decade and a half while I personally absorbed all property taxes, structural insurance premiums, and facility maintenance costs without ever asking for a single cent of reimbursement. On a brisk Tuesday afternoon, before the final paperwork was signed, I walked the perimeter of the main manufacturing warehouse, inspecting the 40-foot exposed ceilings, the massive wood-turning lathes, the climate-controlled lumber storage rooms, and the 3 high-end CNC routing systems. It was during this inspection that I uncovered a shocking piece of illicit enterprise. Walking past the secondary loading dock, I discovered that Terry, in his blinding arrogance and desperate greed, had already illegally leased out a quarter of our secure warehouse space to a third-party logistics broker for under-the-table cash payments, pocketing the funds directly into his personal account weeks before the corporate transfer was even finalized. This unauthorized sublease constituted a severe breach of Michigan commercial tenancy statutes, compounding his impending downfall with a financial crime. I immediately called my property manager, instructing him to trigger the automatic market rate realignment clause at $45,000 per month and prepare the commercial eviction notices the moment the ink dried, knowing that when Terry failed to pay, we would legally padlock the building and seize every machine inside under strict creditor lien laws, ensuring his victory tour ended in ruin. The final night at the house on Cascade Road arrived with a stillness that settled over the darkened rooms like a heavy shroud. Outside, the early spring wind rustled through the leafless oak trees, while inside, the empty hallways echoed with the ghosts of 15 years of shared history. The packing was nearly complete. Cardboard boxes labeled with black marker stood neatly stacked against the living room wall, holding the modest remnants of my personal belongings. By tomorrow morning, I would officially hand over the keys to this sprawling estate and relocate to a smaller, peaceful property I had purchased near Ada Township, nestled east of the city where the waters of the Thornapple River flowed through golden timberline fields. Walking through the dimly lit kitchen one last time, my eyes caught the faint traces of a life that once felt permanent. Clara's favorite ceramic coffee mug sitting dry beside the sink, her reading glasses resting on the marble counter, and the bookmarked pages of a novel she would never finish reading. Sitting alone in the dark living room as the clock ticked past midnight, I felt the weight of 15 years of sacrifice pressing against my chest. Reflecting on every family holiday where I had been systematically ignored by the Vance relatives, dismissed as a blue-collar intruder, and framed as a fortune hunter by people who had never worked an honest week in their adult lives. Yet, as the night grew deeper, the haunting question that had hovered in the back of my mind throughout this entire process resurfaced. Was I executing a righteous reckoning, or was I merely consumed by a cold desire for personal retribution? The answer to that moral doubt arrived not through a sudden epiphany, but from the dusty bottom drawer of Clara's bedside nightstand. While conducting a final sweep of the master bedroom, my fingers brushed against a worn leather-bound journal tucked beneath a stack of old stationery, a private diary Clara had kept hidden for over a decade. I sat down on the edge of the stripped mattress, flipped open the yellowed pages, and felt my throat tighten as her familiar, graceful handwriting filled my eyes. Page after heart-wrenching page detailed the hidden agony she had endured at the hands of her own biological son. Clara had recorded every single instance where Terry had brought her to tears through his ruthless disrespect, documenting late-night phone calls where he screamed at her for more money, verbal assaults where he cursed her name when she refused to fund his reckless lifestyle, and moments of heartbreak when he ignored her birth dates and holiday invitations. Reading Clara's raw, tear-stained confessions stripped away every remaining shadow of hesitation, cementing my resolve into a fortress of moral certainty. Her written words were a testament to the emotional terrorism Terry had inflicted upon the woman who had sacrificed everything to raise him, proving beyond doubt that his malice was not a recent development, but a lifelong habit of sociopathic exploitation. Sitting in the darkness of that empty master bedroom, holding the physical evidence of my late wife's secret tears, I realized that my upcoming actions at the courthouse were not a selfish act of personal revenge. They were the execution of long overdue moral justice. I was not breaking the sacred promise I had made beside her hospital bed in her final hours. I was fulfilling it in its purest form. By stepping aside and allowing Terry's own greed to crush him under the weight of his unearned enterprise, I was delivering the ultimate, necessary lesson that Clara had been far too loving to teach him herself. Closing the leather journal, I packed it into my personal leather bag, walked out to the kitchen, and poured one last cup of black coffee before setting the kitchen alarm for sunrise. The doubts had completely vanished, replaced by a serene peace that washed over my entire soul. Tomorrow morning at the Kent County Courthouse on Ottawa Avenue, the final chapter would begin. Trent Blackburn, Terry's high-priced litigator, would fly in from Detroit expecting an easy victory over a defeated, grieving stepfather, completely unaware that he was stepping directly onto a battlefield where the trap was already sprung. I finished my coffee, stared out the window at the dark Georgia-style pines swaying beneath the starless Michigan sky, and felt zero anxiety for the confrontation ahead. I had honored my marriage, I had protected my dignity, and tomorrow, I was going to give Terry Vance every single heavy, beautiful pound of the empire he had plotted so desperately to steal. The morning sun had barely crested the glass skyline of downtown Grand Rapids when I arrived at the Kent County Courthouse on Ottawa Avenue NW, parking my truck in the concrete structure on Leon Street. I sat in the driver's seat for a full 2 minutes with the engine off, watching the city wake up through the windshield, before stepping out with a single manila folder held firmly under my arm. Inside the quiet marble corridor outside Hearing Room 3B, David Fox was already waiting, looking like a man who hadn't slept a wink, his eyes tracing my every move as I walked up. He gave me one last searching look, asking if I was truly ready to go through with this without filing a single counter motion. I simply adjusted the lapel of my charcoal suit, the very same suit I had worn to Clara's funeral, and told him there was nowhere else on earth I'd rather be. Before he could respond, the heavy brass doors at the end of the hallway swung open, and the Vance family contingent strutted toward us like a victorious royal court arriving for a long-awaited coronation. Terry walked at the center of the group wearing a brand-new, tailored charcoal suit with faint silver pinstripes bought specifically for his victory lap, his fresh haircut and triumphant posture radiating an unbearable level of performative arrogance. Flanking him were Aunt Evelyn, holding her leather handbag like a trophy, and Uncle Richie, nodding smugly at the security guards as if he already owned the municipal building. Leading their legal vanguard was Trent Blackburn, a high-profile, silver-haired corporate litigator who had flown in from Detroit specifically to oversee my surrender. Blackburn carried himself with the supreme condescension of an attorney who charged $800 an hour to crush smaller opponents. Dropping his custom Italian leather briefcase onto the mahogany conference table across from us with a loud, practiced thud designed to inflict maximum psychological damage. He didn't bother greeting David, nor did he offer a handshake. Instead, he settled into his leather chair, adjusted his gold cufflinks, and looked at me with an expression of contempt, clearly viewing me as nothing more than an uneducated blue-collar opportunist who had finally been forced to crawl back to the working class where he belonged. The arrogance in the room reached a peak as the preliminary administrative proceedings began before the presiding clerk. Trent Blackburn opened his leather portfolio with slow, theatrical deliberation, leaning forward to deliver a series of sharp, biting barbs aimed directly at my dignity. Looking across the table with a cold, dismissive smirk, Blackburn mockingly congratulated me for having the sense to surrender, rather than dragging my late wife's estate through a legal slaughter that would have left me completely bankrupt. He sneered that a man of my limited background should never have been allowed to hold the keys to a luxury corporate empire in the first place, openly ridiculing my 15 years of sweat equity as nothing more than an extended, glorified maintenance contract. He went so far as to casually remark to the court recorder that it was always gratifying to watch a penniless gold digger voluntarily walk away empty-handed, assuring his client that I would be vacating the Cascade Road estate without a single dime to my name by nightfall. Terry let out a loud, mocking chuckle at his attorney's performance, leaning back in his chair with his arms crossed, reveling in what he truly believed was my complete public humiliation. I sat through the entire barrage of insults without a single muscle twitching in my face, keeping my expression neutral while letting their toxic bravado fill the room until it was suffocating. When Blackburn finally finished his condescending monologue and slid the 42-page transfer agreement across the table with a theatrical gesture of finality, expecting me to hesitate, plead for a settlement, or shed tears of defeat, I didn't say a single word. I simply uncapped my silver fountain pen, flipped smoothly to the final signature page where David had placed a yellow tab, and signed my name with a steady, unflinching hand. The crisp scratch of the pen against the paper was the only sound in the silent room. I slid the entire signed binder back across the mahogany surface directly into Blackburn's hands, looking him dead in the eye with a calm, unblinking gaze that instantly made the high-priced Detroit lawyer frown in confusion. He had expected a broken man begging for mercy. Instead, he was looking at a man who had just handed over a ticking financial bomb with a quiet, terrifying smile. The heavy silence in hearing room 3B hung thick as Trent Blackburn pulled my signed 42-page transfer document toward his side of the mahogany table. He picked up his gold fountain pen, clearly intending to perform a quick, superficial verification signature to officially close out his client's triumph. But as his eyes began scanning the pages, the high-priced Detroit litigator's posture gradually shifted. His relaxed, predatory slouch stiffened into an unnatural rigidity. His fingers tightened around the edges of the heavy cream paper, turning his knuckles white. I watched the color drain from his face in distinct stages, the smug smirk vanishing first, replaced by a deep, panicked furrow between his silver eyebrows as he flipped frantically back and forth between the primary transfer pages and the embedded addendums. The room's air turned ice cold as Blackburn reached Section 7, subsection D. The carefully hidden legal landmines David Fox had embedded were finally exploding right under his nose. He read the change of control clause on our First Commerce Bank credit facility, realizing that by accepting full corporate share ownership, Terry Vance had automatically assumed the entire corporate debt ledger while releasing my personal guarantee. The bank's mandatory 30-day recall covenant had been triggered, demanding an immediate repayment of $1,500,000 in cash, a sum Terry did not possess. Blackburn's eyes then dropped to the real estate disclosures. Discovering that the manufacturing warehouses on the Logan Holdings property were private land assets owned exclusively by my private entity, and that the executed transfer agreement automatically triggered a binding commercial market rate lease realignment of $45,000 per month. To cap off the total destruction, Blackburn realized that my personal funding for the high-end legal defense team in the pending multi-million-dollar product liability lawsuit had ceased effective immediately, dumping a $2.3 million civil claim directly onto Terry's undefended corporate shoulders. "Trent, what is taking so long? Just sign it so we can leave." Terry crowed impatiently, completely oblivious to the legal trap springing around his neck. Blackburn slowly removed his reading glasses with a hand that was visibly shaking. His voice was barely a rasp as he leaned toward his client, informing him that he had just legally assumed over $3 million in immediate, unbacked liabilities, and that failure to pay the $45,000 monthly rent would result in an instant commercial eviction and a complete asset seizure. The reality of his catastrophic victory hit Terry like a physical blow. The color vanished from his face, his smug composure shattering into sheer terror. Realizing he had been completely outmaneuvered, Terry lost his mind. In a fit of frantic desperation, he lunged across the mahogany table, screaming hysterically as he tried to grab the transfer documents to rip them to shreds with his bare hands. Before Terry's fingers could even touch the paperwork, 2 armed county sheriff's deputies stationed at the back of the courtroom reacted with lightning speed. They slammed him down onto the hard oak table, pinning his arms behind his back with a loud, metallic clink of handcuffs while sternly warning him that any further destructive outbursts would result in an immediate criminal charge for felony destruction of court records and contempt of court. The spectacle of Terry writhing in handcuffs completely broke the Vance family front. Seeing the horrific financial abyss opening up beneath Terry's feet and watching him being subdued like a common criminal, Aunt Evelyn and Uncle Richie recoiled in horror. Desperate to protect their own bank accounts and social standing from being dragged down into his impending bankruptcy, Evelyn publicly declared in a sharp, trembling voice that Terry was entirely on his own, while Richie backed rapidly toward the exit doors without offering a single word of comfort. The predatory Vance coalition evaporated in 60 seconds flat, leaving a weeping, terrified Terry completely abandoned in handcuffs as I picked up my briefcase, straightened my tie, and walked smoothly past his ruined empire into the bright morning sun. The dominoes fell with systematic timing in the weeks that followed, exactly as the numbers had dictated. The morning after the hearing, First Commerce Bank officially issued a 30-day demand note for the full $1,500,000 credit balance and placed an immediate administrative freeze on all outward corporate accounts. Deprived of liquidity, Terry failed to clear payroll that very Friday, causing 80 master woodworkers, men with zero loyalty to an arrogant kid who treated manual labor like dirt, to walk off the assembly floor in unison, leaving half-finished walnut dining tables rotting on the production lines. Unfilled luxury orders triggered massive non-delivery penalties from showrooms across Chicago and Detroit, while the undefended product liability lawsuit landed a staggering $2.3 million civil judgment in early June. By week 4, Terry defaulted on the $45,000 monthly rent owed to Logan Holdings LLC. The bank seized what remained of the corporate name, the court plaintiffs targeted his personal assets, and his beloved $70,000 company Ram 1500 was repossessed right out of a suburban driveway on a humiliating Tuesday morning. Yet, I refused to let 80 honest craftsmen pay the ultimate price for Terry's sociopathic arrogance. Because my commercial landlord lien took legal priority over the abandoned manufacturing machinery, I executed a quiet foreclosure sale, purchasing the industrial lathes, kilns, and CNC routing systems back for pennies on the dollar to satisfy the rent debt. I then rehired every single one of those master woodworkers under a newly established entity, Pierce Fine Woodworking LLC. They returned to the exact same workshop floor, using the exact same tools, but this time backed by a rock-solid private structure that valued their labor, paid them above-market wages, and ensured their livelihoods would never again be weaponized by corporate parasites. My late wife's artistic legacy wasn't destroyed. It was simply cleansed, reborn, and placed back into the hands of the people who actually built it. The final, crushing confrontation with Terry arrived on a warm Saturday afternoon at a gas station off Highway 21 near Ada Township. I was filling up my truck when a beat-up, rusted 90s sedan pulled up to the adjacent pump, driven by an acquaintance who looked embarrassed to be seen with his passenger. Out of the passenger side stumbled Terry Vance, the former heir to a luxury empire, now stripped of his designer suits, his pristine truck, and his artificial swagger. He wore a faded, oversized t-shirt. His hair was unwashed, and his eyes were hollowed out by the weight of rock-bottom reality. Spotting me across the concrete pavement, Terry froze before taking a desperate step forward, his voice cracking into a trembling sob as he begged me for a second chance, pleading for an entry-level job in my new workshop or even a small loan to cover his basic living expenses. I stood beside my truck holding the gas nozzle and met his gaze with unshakable composure. I didn't yell, I didn't gloat, and I didn't offer a single word of empty comfort. I simply looked at him, letting the silence deliver the ultimate message. He had made his choice, he had reaped his harvest, and the bank of my mercy was permanently closed. I hung up the pump nozzle, stepped into my truck, and drove away without looking back in the rearview mirror once. By late June, the sun came through the heavy midsummer timberline near Ada Township in long, patient rays of golden green, illuminating the stretch of land backing up to the Thornapple River. On a peaceful Saturday morning, I planted a young sugar maple tree in the backyard, pressing my bare palm flat against the cool, rough bark anchored deep into the fertile Michigan soil. Clara had always loved maples, often reminding me that they were the most honest trees because they never hid what season they were passing through. Standing there listening to the river move behind the tree line, I looked up at the blue sky and whispered a final, serene message to the woman I had loved with all my heart. I had kept my word. I had taken care of her son by letting him face the full, unvarnished truth of his own actions, and I had protected the honest people who depended on her name. The bill for 17 years of greed and deception had come due. Every last cent had been collected by the universe, and we were finally at peace. If this story reminded you that karma always collects what it's owed and that true strength doesn't need to shout to win, hit that like button, subscribe to Dad's Ultimate Payback, and drop a comment below letting me know where you're watching from today. I'll see you on the next one.